This next session is going to be focused on India, which I know is of interest to many of you. Obviously, even if you are not reporting from there, it's an increasingly important factor in trade in the region and in the world. So joining us, we have Manu Bhaskaran. He is the founding CEO of Centennial Asia Advisors, which is the Singapore subsidiary of Centennial Group. It's a strategic advisory firm, and he has specifically worked and talked about and focuses on macroeconomic trends in Asia. So this is an area in which he is very well versed. He has said that you are welcome to interrupt him with questions whenever one arises. So just raise your hands and we'll get you a mic. And please, and I also wanted to mention that he is a senior research fellow at the Institute of Policy Studies in Singapore, which some of you may be familiar with. If you're not, it's another good resource for experts on these sorts of issues. So with that, please join me in welcoming Manu.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Really? Yeah. Great. So I'm going to spend about 15 odd minutes just touching on a few things. First, I want to put India in context, give a characterization of India as an economy, as a place. Secondly, I want to specifically look at its position in world trade, and then spend the rest of the time looking at the future. Where is India headed in terms of its trade and other directions? So I guess all of you, even those who don't cover India, know that India is a very complex and diverse place. But it is also very unique. And there's always this constant comparison between India and China, which is difficult to do. I mean, India is more like Europe, a collection of different nations that have come together and have a common identity, but very much diverse, unlike China, which is very homogeneous. The political economy is different. But it always gets compared and it looks bad. But actually, when you look at India's track record over the last few decades, it's actually not bad. It's just not very good compared to India, right? And if you look at the history of India's growth, during the colonial period, it really suffered, and per capita incomes barely grew. In fact, it took a big dip first, and then they grew again. And then you had independence, and you had a period of very slow, very mediocre growth, 3 to 4%. The joke in those days was this is the Hindu rate of growth, as if it was something that was destined, right? Then what you saw was in the early 80s, there was a very slow period of very tentative, very limited reforms, but that was enough to lift the rate of growth to around 5 point something percent, very similar to Indonesia's rate of growth in the same decade. Even though Indonesia had opened up much faster, had liberalized much faster, India still managed to match that growth. Then it was hit by the 91 crisis, and after that, growth then accelerated again. And since then, we've had periods of very strong growth, but somehow those periods always ended in some kind of sudden halt, right? Because of some problem or other financial currency or whatever. So that's been the pattern of growth. What I think is going to happen is that India is primed again for another of its occasional surges of growth. The improvement in infrastructure in India is actually remarkable. For anyone who has gone through Indian airports and roads and so on in the late 80s, early 90s, it is night and day. I would say the airports in Bombay and Delhi are as good as any in the world, and maybe better than the best in the world, right? And that's huge improvement, right? But it's not just infrastructure, not just physical infrastructure. You've got financial inclusion. You've got improvements in red tape, although there's a long way to go. India still remains a difficult place to do business, and that's just a fact. But the delivery of state services has improved. Social spending is now channeled through direct cash transfers. And that has really become much more efficient. And so there have been real improvements on the ground. And I would say that the other improvements, like the bankruptcy code, which will now allow more significant process of creative destruction, which is what you need in a market economy, and which was blocked before. So there's a lot of good things that are coming together, confluencing together. And I think India should see growth accelerate above 7% in the next few years, right? Um, the real question is, if you look beyond all this, how can we characterize India, right? How do you sort of come to a few bullet points and sort of give a accurate and not oversimplified view of India? I would say two things. One is that India's story, unlike China, is one of the patient accumulation of small incremental improvements. And they go unseen below the surface. People who visit India, especially those who have not visited before, see the disorganization, all kinds of problems, and come back very negative. But if you look beyond that, actually, you see these slow improvements. And these slow improvements reach a critical point, and suddenly, boom, you get this period of growth, right? And I think that's what you're going to see very soon. Second point I'd make is that good enough, right? Years ago, my partners and I, we wrote a book on India, India in 2039. It's a 30-year outlook on India. And we posed the question, is India, a determined marathoner like China, able to sustain a high pace of running growth for a long period of time? Or is it only an occasional sprinter, where it sprints, fantastic growth, and poof, it's exhausted, no stamina, and you get a period of slower growth? So far, the data seems to suggest that it is really an occasional sprinter and not a marathoner. But maybe it's going to change. So let's think about that. So that's the first set of things I wanted to say. The second point is, where are we on trade? India is quite often seen as a very closed economy, but actually that is changing significantly. Just in the last few years, we've seen the trade ratio, trade to GDP ratio, go from 40 to 49%. It is rapidly becoming actually quite an open economy, unlike before. When you dig deeper, what you find is its share of world exports over the last 2 decades has grown, but it is still minuscule at 1.8%. It's lower than ASEAN. It's nowhere near China, obviously. It is still not a major exporter of goods. And compared to that, its share of world imports is 2.8%. You can immediately see a problem. 2.8% of world imports, but only 1.8% of world exports of goods, right? And that means you automatically, obviously, you have a deficit in the goods balance, and that puts pressure on the currency and constrains the economy, right? However, the good news is its share of world exports of services has increased significantly. Last year to 6%, and just 4 years ago, 5 years ago, it was 4.4%. And the growth is in modern services, value-added services. These capability centers where young Indian professionals they're not doing customer service and the previous type of offshore services, which was, still remunerative, but low end, right? This is much higher value stuff, right? It includes R&D, it includes interpretation of radiography results and so on. So this is high value stuff. And India is really growing rapidly in that area, right? So that's the good news. But again, we got to dig deeper, right? And trade economists look at value add rather than the nominal value of trade, right? As you know, when you're an export-oriented economy, quite often you're using a lot of imported inputs, processing it, and then exporting it abroad. So what we want to see is how much value are you generating within your own economy? Because that is what is going to grow your economy. That is what is going to pay salaries and offer an improving quality of life for your people, right? And we look at value add. What we try to do is we look at participation in what we call global value chains. You've been covering trade for the last few days, as you know. Global value chains is this whole process that evolved over the last 20 years, where global corporations slice and dice different parts of the production of a finished good and allocate it to different parts of the world depending on where they would be most profitable. And quite often the same ultimate product may cross borders several times. So for instance, an electronic component could come to Singapore, where one or two of the high value components are produced, shipped to Penang for some testing and quality control, and then shipped back to Singapore for the final value addition. So you could get these multiple moves, right? So those are the value chains that the multinational corporations have built. And the most successful trading countries, Vietnam and so on, have seen their participation in GVCs grow significantly, and that has really helped boost their economic growth. India's participation in GVCs has actually been quite weak. It grew until the global financial crisis in 2008, and then it actually declined quite significantly after that. So India is not making the kind of strides you need to see in value addition to its goods export, right? And it needs to do a lot more in that area. So again, let's go a bit further, right? Quite often in developing economies, what drives export-oriented manufacturing will be foreign investment, right? Why is foreign investment important? Not so much for the capital it brings, although that is important, can be important, but the really important thing about foreign investment is that you get a package. You get management, you get technology, you get access to market, you get product development, you got branding, everything together. If a country wanted to build that on its own, it would take decades, right? And even then, you may not be competitive, right? But the foreign direct investor brings it, you got a package, and you have this shortcut to growth. And that's why you get these rapid rates of growth in export-oriented economies, China, Southeast Asia, now Vietnam, maybe Mexico to some extent, right? So what is India's share of global flows of foreign direct investment? It's quite low, only 1.5% in 2022. We just got the data for 2023. I've not had time to go through it, but it looks like it actually did not do much, right? And it was actually much higher in the 2000s. It was about 3.6% then. So India is not doing a good job in securing the foreign investment flows that are necessary to produce the shortcuts that help you accelerate economic growth. Okay? So that is one big problem. And I think it is a particular problem now because, in economic development, you get these once in a generation, sometimes once in multiple generations opportunity. There is one such opportunity right now. That is that a massive amount of manufacturing production is going to be relocated from China to somewhere else. And if India misses the boat, it misses it permanently. If all that stuff goes to Bangladesh, to Vietnam, to Mexico, to Morocco, Turkey, it's India's loss. And you'll never get it again. So there is some urgency in this. There's another urgency in that, quite often when people talk about India, they say, well, the one big advantage India has over China, over East Asia, any other countries is demographics. It has population growth, its workforce is going to grow, the median age is low compared to China, where in China, of course, workforce is already declining and will age significantly. But the economists I speak to in India tell me that that advantage will last at best another 9 to 10 years. By 2035, India will begin to age, right? So you have another window, a short window, to take full advantage of this demographic advantage. And if policy fails to allow India to take advantage of this, then I think that would be quite sad for India, and it would set back India significantly. So despite all the anecdotal evidence, the news reports of Foxconn setting up production in India and so on, those are anecdotes. When you look at the data and aggregate it, in the aggregate, India is still not doing well enough in this critical area, right? The other dimension of trade, apart from the numbers, is connectivity through trade agreements and other forms of economic partnership. And here again, India has been a laggard. If you compare Vietnam, which is increasingly seen as one of the great success stories of economic development, going through a few problems right now, but these are temporary, I think. Vietnam is very adept at securing trade agreements. And they don't go for low standard trade agreements where you don't have to give much and you don't get much in return, right? They go for trade agreements with Europe, the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. These are onerous trade agreements. These are very intrusive. They require real painful reforms in areas like government procurement, management of state enterprises, um, labor unions. And Vietnam has been prepared to do that, to make the hard choices, right? Now, India has avoided that. India walked out of the Regional and Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. And when you go to India and speak to the senior policymakers, there's absolutely no appreciation of the benefits of these agreements. I mean, they feel that they've done the right thing. And this is, I think, one of the big problems which we can talk about later, right? So basically, the second part of what I wanted to say is this characterization of India's position in trade. It's improving, it's becoming more open, but it is nowhere near enough to produce the sustained high and quality growth that the country needs. That's what I would say. So let's go to the final part of what I wanted to talk about, which is the the future. How likely is it that India's footprint in the global economy is going to grow? Overall, actually, I'm quite optimistic. But let's go through it step by step. First of all, what is the global context? The global context is not very positive, right? There is an increasing degree of trade protectionism in both developed as well as developing economies. And India and Indonesia have, by the way, been one of the countries that have actually been most aggressive in imposing new trade restrictions, right? So the world is getting less open. The pace of globalization is slowing. I don't think you're getting de-globalization, but you're certainly getting slowbalization, right? So that's one problem. And another problem is, of course, that you have artificial intelligence, and the jury is out. Nobody really knows what the implications are. But many people would argue that AI is going to make what is now labor-intensive modes of production displace those and allow developed countries to take back some of the production that had been outsourced to poorer countries. In other words, the opportunities for export-led manufacturing, the export-led route to higher incomes could be limited. Even in the area where India has succeeded, which is modern services, the argument is that AI can displace rather than augment labor. So, that's the pessimistic view, right? But I wonder if that is actually correct or not. People I respect and who are very good economists, like Raghuram Rajan, Danny Roderick, their argument is that countries, latecomers to economic development, India, Indonesia, and all that, have missed the boat. And export-led manufacturing is not really a viable pathway. And Rajan's argument is that India really should focus on modern services. Similarly, Roderick. And these are very good people. I think, however, that this is too downbeat a view. The impact of technology is really quite complex. If you look at the most recent data on reshoring, that is when production is taken from a developing country like China and brought back to the developed economy, high cost, right? It's very limited. We are seeing some of that happen in China, from China to Japan, from China back to Taiwan, from China back to South Korea, but very little actually going back to the US or to Europe, right? So I think reshoring, at least so far, is limited. Now, so the process of supply chain reconfiguration, which is going to reshape trade patterns, is actually very complex. So reshoring, which I think is still quite limited. Maybe with AI, it becomes more widespread, but I'm not convinced. The other, dynamic is what we call nearshoring. So there is still a case for production to be located in a low-cost production base, but for various reasons, proximity to the end market is very important, right? And this is where countries like Mexico, which has a trade agreement with the US, or Turkey and Morocco, which have trade agreements with the EU, will benefit, right? And it would not be so much Asia. But where there is a continuing case for offshoring, i.e., production is viable in a low-cost base and proximity to end market does not matter, then it still seems to be from the data we get and from the anecdotal evidence from company announcements, and when you try to understand what shapes company decisions, Asia is still the leader, and the big winners are still Vietnam, Bangladesh, increasingly Thailand and Malaysia, even though they are more developed and higher cost in some areas, right? So the patterns of change in world trade are complex. And in that complex, so far, it doesn't look as if India is gaining a good share of this relocation, right? Then the question is India now doing enough to strengthen its competitiveness in export? So you have to ask yourself the question, what determines export competitiveness? Right? Many people would say it's labor cost, right? And yes, that's true to some extent, but actually limited. I think the most important thing is really the overall ecosystem. What do I mean by that? Ecosystem is not just labor costs, but government support mechanisms, infrastructure, agglomeration effects. So if you look at the Pearl River Delta, where China's manufacturing, a lot of China's manufacturing is based, you've got this tremendous economies of scale and scope. You got so many component manufacturers fiercely competing against each other, honing their skills, continuously improving their advantages. So it's not just cost, it's quality, it's delivery times. Those component suppliers can produce prototypes within a couple of days, whereas in most other countries it might take weeks to do so. So it's this overall ecosystem which is very important, right? And that's what India is competing against. You're competing against clusters of manufacturing in many parts of the world. For instance, you're competing with the Pearl River Delta. You're competing with the Penang Kulim corridor in Malaysia, which is super competitive in different parts of the electronics value chain. You're competing with the Iskandar region, which is just across the water from Singapore, which is very good in electronics contract manufacturing, right? You're competing with the several clusters of manufacturing in the north and south of Vietnam. There's a huge cluster of electronics manufacturing that's now growing very close to the Hanoi area in North Vietnam, right? It's those ecosystems that you're competing with. So you've got to recreate these ecosystems, and that's not easy. Can be done. Vietnam recreated from nothing the ecosystem for becoming competitive in mobile telephony. That's why Samsung is so dominant in the Vietnamese economy. It can be done, but it takes time, right? So back to the question of is India doing enough? In terms of infrastructure, there's been tremendous improvement. Yes? Is that a question?
If you can, I'm from India, from Bombay. If you could just speak about when you say recreating the ecosystem, what do you mean?
Like what I said, I mean, it's the combination of agglomeration effects, having lots of competing component manufacturers, suppliers of services. So when they compete against each other, there's so many of them, it drives down costs, right? When you have so many sort of interlocking and supporting industries co-located, there's synergies between them. Uh, Knowledge transfer is very rapid, which is important to skills development. There's competition for labor, so labor is trained properly and so on. So it's this whole ecosystem.
So basically, attracting as much business as possible.
That's the first step. But how do you attract that, right? I mean, you have to provide them with good infrastructure. You got to assure them that, okay, if you come in and invest in this place, in this country, we will not suddenly retroactively impose a huge tax bill on you going
Right.
back 10, 15 years. You know what
Right.
I'm talking about,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Vodafone. That is just so ridiculous, right? And, you know, there's this whole mess of issues. So it goes beyond attracting lots of businesses, including local ones, by the way,
Right.
is important, but it's not the only thing. You've got to go beyond that, right? Did I answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks. So let's dig a bit deeper. Why is this happening? And I think a lot of it is to do with policy. Yes, I think the good news is in India over the last 15, 20 years, you have seen really, really, really good improvements in policy. But it's a fiercely competitive world, and the fact is it good enough, right? And right now, I think it hasn't reached that point yet. And I think a lot of it is due to this pessimism in Indian policymakers thinking, the political leadership thinking. And the impression I get, and I could be wrong. I mean, I'm not Indian origin, but I'm Singaporean. I may not know India as well as some of you, but my impression is that Indian policymakers really do not believe that India can be competitive. Right? They have this great pessimism about India's ability, particularly to compete with China. Right? Personally, I think that's wrong. When I was growing up, long time ago, the fans in our room were Usha fans from India. A lot of the trucks on the road were Tata trucks. Why is it the tuk-tuks, the motorized uh, rickshaws in Indonesia called bajai? It's a corruption of Bajaj. The Bajaj used to provide. So India was super competitive in the old days. It lost it. No reason why it cannot regain it, right? With the right policy, right? So I think it's wrong. I think this pessimism is wrong, right? With the right, and the infrastructure is moving in the right direction. I can tell you there are dramatic improvements, and it's beginning to show up in measures like the Logistics Performance Index, which tells you that the infrastructure is not just nice spanking highways, but it's actually reducing costs for businesses. For instance, forget about the golden quadrilateral between big metros that everyone knows about, but even between second and third tier cities, say I know South India better. You drive from Coimbatore in Tamil Nadu to Palghat, not too far away in Kerala. It used to take 4 hours on a horrible road. Today it takes 1.5 hours. Now that you think about it, if you're running a bus service, you can utilize your buses at double the pace than before. That goes straight to your bottom line. The rate of return on your investment in that bus doubles. That's a great incentive to invest, to make more money, right? These are just simple things, and it's very powerful. So good things are happening, but you need to go a lot further. If you have tariffs, and the tariffs that India imposes on imported inputs has actually increased in the last decade, then you deter investment because your costs become too great and you cannot compete with the rest of the world. Vietnam is doing the opposite, opening up. So I think we could go on and on, but this pessimism is, I think, a deterrent to the kind of policy reforms we need. I think this pessimism has a lot to do with India's fear of China, this competition with China. The experience in opening up trade to China has not been a good one from the policymakers' view. The trade deficit with China is massive. I don't know, 60 billion or 80 billion, incredible, and continuing to increase despite everything India tries to do. So that's a sore point, and that is one of the principal reasons why India walked away from RCEP. But if I may say so, I think trade diplomacy has also got a lot to do with this. Actually, India's problems with RCEP were quite reasonable. India's view is, look, I'm competitive in services. You guys are competitive in goods. If I open up to your goods, you must open up to my services. But ASEAN was not prepared to cut that deal. It was a reasonable request. So India had a good case, but unfortunately, the trade diplomacy did not work. I once joked, and the joke didn't go down very well, that the best way to reduce the lifespan of a trade negotiator is to ask him to or her to negotiate with India. I mean, you'll have a very short life. I mean, it's very, very difficult. I can tell you that. Yeah? And I've had some personal experience of that. But I think it's all connected to this pessimism about competitiveness. So, to end on a more positive note, I think the infrastructure is improving. I think there will be some gains from industrial policies like the production-linked incentives and all that. And over time, slowly, I think you will find that an ecosystem is being built. And what we are seeing now is that the subset of goods that India is actually globally competitive in is increasing. Two-wheelers, pharmaceuticals, all kinds of engineering goods, automotive electronics beginning to have an impact. So I think I would end on a more positive note. I think things will gradually improve, but the question is, will it improve fast enough to satisfy the voters and people of India? So yes, let me open up.
This is Mia from South China Morning Post in Hong Kong, and I also wrote a lot of story about China's supply chain shipment. So I have three questions.
Mhm.
So first one is, I have been talking to some manufacturers who removed their factories from China to India, and what I heard their complaint is still the infrastructure system, like the grid is not like the electricity is not very stable, and there's some draining problem, and it's kind of like dragging down the productivity. And also the recent complaint I actually heard is extreme heat weather in India. It's also like kind of dragging down the productivity. So I want to know like how much the recent progress in Indian government targeting this kind of problems, because like it's a new opportunity in the supply chain shipment. And the second thing is, I remember in 2014, like Indian government introduced Made in India 2025, and to promote the portion of manufacturing sector from 15% to 25%. And I also like a bit curious about the recent progress. And the third one is you talk about the ecosystem. So I can share some about like China. So for China, the ecosystem is I think it's the same for all around the world. Like to move up from the supply chain to the high end chain. And for China, like in 2023, last year, over 50% of the product exported is basically like high end products, high tech products, and it's a pretty fascinating like result. And I want to believe this is something like both for India, for Vietnam, for the rest of the world, like they want to take a share from the high-end high-end industry. So how much effort like India is making? I read the data about like mobile phone, like back in 2024, 78% of the mobile phone, like smartphone used in the India, it relies on imports. And right now, over 99.2% of mobile phones is locally made. But it's basically either like American brand or like Korean brand or Chinese brand. So like you said there's a pessimism, but I'm pretty shocked because there are so many ICT talents in India, and there are a lot of like labor talents. Like how is like Indian government is seeing?
Okay, so let me tackle step by step, right? All developing economies have problems, right? If you had gone to China in 1992, the first year I visited, infrastructure was terrible, power is not that great. You had issues with labor, rural workers moving to urban areas, not knowing the quality standards and so on. So this is typical of any developing country, right? Question is at the bottom line. What is the bottom line? Pros versus cons. What are global corporations deciding to do? So I'll give you this example of a very large manufacturer, and 2 years ago they told this person who was interviewing them that there's no way they're going to move to India. A couple of months ago, the guy saw the CFO again. The CFO is busy learning all about Indian tax code. Why? Well, we've decided that there is no choice. We have to go to India, and we have to deal with the shit, whatever. Just have to do it, right? So this is the change, right? What the key thing is, what is the bottom line, right? And the bottom line is increasingly people are going to say that just like in the 2000s, boards of directors told their CEOs, if you don't have a China strategy, then you're out. You have to have a China strategy. I think you're coming to the point where the boards will ask the CEOs, what's your India strategy? If you don't have an India strategy, you're missing something. So that's the bottom line. Now, what's driving that bottom line? Like I said, all these countries are starting off with difficulties. China started off, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, all of them. Even today, Vietnam is suffering from power shortages. But it is the direction of change. So, my personal experience in India with my in-laws and all that is that power shortages have improved dramatically. Water shortages, I'm talking about Tamil Nadu, south of India, improved dramatically. government support for industry improved dramatically. So India is diverse. You go to the right places, the southern states, Gujarat, a couple of other places, you get tremendous support, and you can do well. Is it going to be difficult? Yeah. Let's face it. The countries that had fewer problems, East Asia, China, East Asia, Southeast Asia, they've already developed. If you want to invest in new countries for new growth, you're going to go to countries that are laggards. And there are reasons why they're laggards, right? These countries have problems, but you have a choice. Where is the demand going to come from? Why are Chinese companies keen to invest in India and operate in India? Because that's where the market is. Where else do you have 1.4 billion people, many of whom are young, where the middle class is going to grow incredibly fast? Where is the incremental growth going to come from? Right? You could go to say Africa, but the growth rates are slower, and you're on a continent with I don't know how many 42 countries or something. Very difficult. Where else can you go? Could go to Indonesia, 280 million people, not a bad story, but nothing compared to 1.4 billion people and still growing, right? So that's the bottom line. Then second point I'd make is that if you give a country enough investment and time, these incremental improvements eventually create ecosystems, right? I mean, Malaysia was a rural country, oil palm. I remember driving up when I was young. There were hardly any factories except the usual stuff, a few pharmaceuticals, a brewery, pineapple canning. That's all. But today, you go to the north of uh, Peninsular Malaysia, and you drive from Penang all the way down through Kedah to Perak, you see factory after factory, all the top global corporations of the world. When they first came in, it must have been difficult. But if you stick it out, you do well. Who's done well in India? The old colonial ones like Lever, Unilever, Hindustan Lever now, and a few others, right? Who has done well recently? It's the Koreans, right? Hyundai, LG, Samsung. Uh, surveys of Indian consumers suggest that they know that these are Korean companies, but they consider these companies to be Indian, right? They like dealing with these guys. So if you stick it out in India and you pay the very high tuition fees, eventually you start making a lot of money, serious amounts of money, right? So to me, that's the bottom line. I don't know if I answered every question, but I think I've given you a flavor. Yeah. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Uzmi. I am from Delhi, India.
Right.
I have a couple of questions.
Right.
First of all, thank you for the great, insightful talk.
Thank you.
So, what implications do you see the Chabar port deal have on the trade relations, Chabar port deal with Iran, and especially in view of the South China Sea? And the second question would be, in the past decade, India's relation with its immediate neighbors have changed a lot. A lot of it is also because of its own diplomatic policies and also because of the increasing influence of China in the region. Again, what implications on trade do you see on that? Thank you.
Well, I think to me, Chaba is not so important. What is more important is the announcement in the last couple of days of this huge new port in Bombay that's going to be part of the Middle East corridor from India, Middle East to Europe. I think that is going to be much more significant. Chaba, I'm not sure what the motivations there are. But remember, ports, it's always a question of network effect. Why is it this expensive place is so competitive as a port compared to the port of Tanjong Pelepas, which is, by the way, a very efficient port, just a few kilometers away up the water. Um, why? Because of network effect. All the liners are here because all the other liners are here. So you interconnect very quickly, right? Ship comes in, quick turnaround time, transfer to the other ship, it goes out. But if you're a smaller port without those network effects, you don't have so many liners come in. Ship comes in, unloads, you wait 2 weeks for the next liner to come. That's not competitive. Right? So is Chaba on the global sea lanes where you get that kind of network effect? I'm not so sure. And certainly with sanctions, if the Iran political situation the way it is, can't see that being a material thing. But I forgot the name. Is it Vardhavan, something like that? That port. They just announced this massive. That is, I think, going to be quite. I mean, it's a difficult one because the one that matters is Pakistan, which is 200 odd million people and few $100 billion GDP. The rest are very small. And for political reasons, that is going to be difficult, right? Except when you have an onion shortage, you get some onions from Pakistan, but otherwise it's going to be difficult, right? So I think ultimately, trade is very much a function of geographical proximity. There's these gravitational models that determine trade patterns, right? The closer you are, the more you trade with your neighbors, but that is not available to India. It often surprises me that, historically, Southeast Asia was an Indic civilization, right? I mean, you look at some of the political leaders around the region, and they all have names. Srita in Thailand, that's a Sanskrit name, obviously, right? Same thing in Indonesia. The former president was Yudhoyono, right? Susilo, Indian, right? So you have India starting off with an advantage in terms of culture and history, and yet its relationship with Southeast Asia is actually very small, and the economic ties are very, very small. So they talk about look east, act east, and all that, but nothing happened. Very little happened. So it seems to me to be a missed opportunity. And part of it is to do with political relations. There's some awkwardness with Malaysia. But I think India should really try harder. I mean, if it wants to compete in this geopolitical game, Southeast Asia is going to be one of the principal arenas for big power contestation. And it's going to be vital, I think, to the whole thing. So it just surprises me, actually. I'm not sure what the reasons are. But of late, India seems to be focused less on Southeast Asia and more on the Middle East. The development of relations with UAE and Saudi and countries like that seems to be progressing faster than with our part of the world. Yeah.
Hi, this is Ian Lee from Taiwan, reporting for Bloomberg. So the relationship between India and Taiwan seems to be warming up in recent years.
Taiwan and
India.
Yeah.
Yep. And in terms of international politics and economic profiles, it seems that the two countries share a lot of mutual interest and have a lot of space for cooperation. For example, like Foxconn is expanding its investments in India, and PSMC has just announced to help Tata to build a new fab in Gujarat. So for you, what are the opportunities and perhaps obstacles for Taiwan and India to foster a closer relationship in terms of political as well as economic cooperation? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the geopolitical dimension is going to dominate. India confronts China across the Himalayan border and is in a militarily disadvantaged position there, even though it has some of the commanding heights, the technology and sophistication and quantity of Chinese power is so significant. So basically what I'm saying is that if India steps up strategic cooperation with Taiwan, say it sells BrahMos missiles, I think China can significantly ramp up the pressure on the Himalayan border, and that would be a deterrent to India. And I think India is very aware of that. So India has to be very, very careful about how it nurtures its relationship with Taiwan. So it will probably be on the economic and investment and trade side where the development will be faster, more so than the geopolitical. Although I'm sure the intelligence agencies are in connection with each other. There are obvious areas of cooperation, right? But they will probably keep that very low profile. I suspect. I have no inside information on this. But if I were a Taiwanese manufacturer, I know Southeast Asia very well. I'm already there. Where do I go for growth? Right? And if I see a government that is prepared to support, and particularly a state government that is very efficient and supports wealth creation. I mean, I don't take sides in politics, but I think Tamil Nadu, which I know better, has a state government. I mean, there are a lot of issues with that particular leadership, but they are very pro-business and very pro-foreign business. So if you choose the right place, Foxconn, all these other guys will probably do very well. Particularly if you offer technology transfer to India, which is what India is really keen on. Yeah.
One question here, please. I'm from Bangkok, Thailand. I believe you said India has limited relationship with Southeast
East
Asia.
I mean, it could be much better given
Yeah.
proximity and history.
Yeah. Do you think the BRICS group of nations can change that because Thailand and Malaysia have asked to join in recent weeks?
I have to restrain myself when I talk about BRICS. I mean, it's a collection of basket cases, right? I mean, where is BRICS going to go? I mean, okay, China is okay, big. Russia, has stumbled into a ridiculous war. Brazil, Mexico struggle to grow beyond 3% without running into some kind of external account crisis. South Africa has a whole set of other issues. I mean, there's a reason why Indonesia was invited to join BRICS and said, "Excuse me, not interested. Goodbye. I'm going to join the OECD." Right? So yeah, BRICS is there. It's an interesting thing. It may over time, evolve into something. But what is BRICS in terms of concrete power dynamics? What does it have? It has the new development bank, which lends a small amount of money, not much. It talks about a common currency, which is going to go absolutely nowhere because it's not an optimal currency area. Just basic economics. It's nonsense, right? So yeah, BRICS is interesting. If I want to show China that I'm, not so close to the US and I'm prepared to, be supportive of your political initiatives, yeah, I'll join BRICS. It's a low cost thing, right? I don't lose anything by doing it. I don't lose anything by being a member of other talk shops like the non-aligned movement and so on. But does it move the needle in any way? I don't think so. So I hope, maybe I'll be proven wrong, but in 10 years' time, I'm sure the same question will come. And Thailand is better off, in my opinion, joining the CPTPP than joining BRICS. The actual, there's investment diversion from Thailand to Vietnam because Vietnam is in CPTPP, but Thailand is not. So I hope when is it Commerce Ministry that is doing the study, I hope they will choose to join CPTPP. It will not be easy because you will have to give up certain things. But others have done it, and the net benefit is what matters. Thailand has an issue, right? 20 years have been lost because of political crisis. In the meantime, Thailand has become an aged society. Growth rates have stalled. Thailand really needs something material, not rhetorical things like BRICS, but things that actually move the needle. And I think CPTPP is a better example, if I can say so. Yeah. I hope I answered the question. Yes.
Hi,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm Silva Shi with Taiwan's Commonwealth Magazine. I have a follow-up questions regarding Taiwan's increasing investment in India. So we've talked to a lot of Taiwanese businessmen, and one of the reasons they invest in India, other than because of the customer ask, because they feel like there's not much competition with Chinese company because the India government has some restriction on the investment from China.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering about your takes on India trade policy toward China. Do you view this policy as a short-term or a long-term policy? Thanks.
My impression is that politics dominates, and June 2020, the Galwan incident, was a defining moment in Sino-Indian relations. I think there was a fundamental shift against China, which I think the Beijing authorities have not fully appreciated. The breakdown of trust. So that affects everything. So already there was this issue about the big trade deficit. China imports a lot, exports a lot to India, but imports very little from India that is of value. There's already that resentment. And then you got this political thing. So now it's very clear. India will do the minimum with China, and they will, which I think is actually gone too far. They are just banning things from China and limiting things from China, which I think will hurt more than benefit. You need low cost inputs from China if you want to be competitive in many industries. That's just a fact of life. And the Europeans are learning that. The Americans are learning that. So, but the other thing is that there's a huge cultural divide between East Asian cultural, the way of thinking, and the Indian way of thinking, and this is a big gap to uh, get across. And a lot of the people you spoke to, for instance, you go with that East Asian mentality and expectations, and you go to South to India, and of course you get a big shock. Right? Um, and so, if you want to invest in these countries, you have to accept that they are very different. They operate very differently. The whole approach to life is just very different, right? But if you do, as the Koreans have done, then you benefit very, very strongly.
So this is Hasi from Bangladesh. I work for Channel 24. So as we see India from Bangladesh, it's like it's one of the important IPS member. So what India IPS Indo-Pacific strategy.
Okay.
So what we see from our perspective, maybe there's a difference, but India is basically US eye in the South Asia. And do you think that's US
India is
eyes for the South Asian to
Mhm.
counter China and their overlapping relationship with Russia buying wells from Iran? Do you think that is causing a lot of harm in the coming days for the new Indian government, which is even still the same political party?
See, India geopolitically has a unique position which no one else has. It is the only country with the heft, with the combination of population, economic size, military power, technology that can make the difference. If India sides with the West against China, China and Russia lose. If India chooses to align itself with China and Russia, the West would struggle. Only India has that big swing factor. India matters. And because India matters to an extent that no other country matters, not Indonesia, not Vietnam, not Brazil, not South Africa, only India has that heft, nuclear power, everything, right? So whether America likes it or not, America has to cut India a lot of slack. India gets away with continuing to buy stuff from Russia. India gets away with relations with Iran because the pragmatic Americans, when they are pragmatic, they realize that you have to keep India on side. No choice, right? So I think India has been quite good, the Jaishankar, at leveraging of that unique position, right? Yeah, and so there will be all these complications that come up occasionally, and you can see in that incident where a Sikh separatist leader was almost murdered. I mean, if you're an American, you must be outraged that somebody from another country tries to murder one of your citizens in your own country, right? But they kept very quiet and they handled it very well, right? Um, so I think India gets cut a lot of slack, but other countries may not enjoy that, right? I think India's attitude is also quite cautious. Um, they don't want to be the eyes and ears of America. They do not want to be used by the US against China. They're very conscious of the fact that they should not be used, right? So they are trying their best to negotiate this very careful balance between the two. But at the end of the day, so long as they perceive a threat from China, they know that in defense and war, technology matters more than ever. Where is the source of defense technology? It's the US, it's France, it's Israel. So it's very clear where ultimately where its interests lie. But it may take a while getting there.
Good morning.
Hi.
Raisa Robles from Manila.
Yes.
I write for South China Morning Post from Manila and Al Jazeera Business Online. I have two questions, but on separate issues. One is India just sold BrahMos missiles to the Philippines. And I'd like to know if weapons is one category that India might be going into, and what is the value added of India to weaponry. Second is you just characterized Thailand. I'd be interested to know how you characterize the Philippines, especially in the light of the fact that it's under a Marcos administration And there is increasing tension between China and the Philippines in the South China Sea.
Yeah. I'm no defense expert, but I know that the BrahMos jointly developed with Russia is something that a lot of countries want, and clearly has a cachet about it. I mean, it must obviously be very good, right? But I don't know about the other elements of India's defense base. It is very domestic orientated. Their efforts to build tanks and fighter aircraft have actually been dismal failures. So there's still a long way to go, I suspect. Um, so it's a matter of technology, and you know, it may require India to cooperate a lot more with the West and with South Korea, for instance, um, and with Israel. Why do you think India has been actually very soft on Israel during Gaza? Right? It's technology transfer on the defense side. So I don't think it's going to be a major defense supplier, except in areas where it has already done quite well, which is BrahMos. I can't think of other areas, right, where it has done well. So the Philippines under Marcos Jr., specifically on the South China Sea, it is very dangerous right now, the confrontation. You have a situation where China is going to push the envelope very aggressively. But you notice that China has been very careful to respect what it thinks is the American red line, which is a violent confrontation involving bullets and missiles and so on. So it uses water cannons, and the latest incident it used swords, I think, right? But it is significant that China tries its best to go below the U.S. red line, not Mr. Marcos's red line, but the U.S. red line, and that is the key thing. The key thing that governs the risk of broader confrontation in the South China Sea involving the Philippines will be the U.S.-China relationship. So long as this is my view, so long as the U.S. and China leaderships are quite clear that they do not want an escalation into an outright conflict, that they must manage their relationship, even though it is a relationship that would be characterized by extraordinary levels of bitter contestation, they do not want war. They do not want a broader confrontation. That is the operating framework. That's the most important thing. So, what if? So it's a game, right? China is pushing the envelope, testing and probing. The US is being careful, strategic ambiguity, but some things are absolutely clear, right? There are two statements issued after the most recent incident, explicitly saying that Article 4 of the Mutual Defense Agreement applies to the second Thomas Shoal. Now, that's a very clear warning to China. When President Marcos Jr. stated in Singapore that the red line would be a fatality, Lord Austin, the Defense Secretary of the United States, was careful when asked about that. He did not explicitly endorse, but neither did he deny what Mr. Marcos said. He just said that the US would work to reduce the risk of confrontation, right? But I think the key thing is what is China's perception of how America will react? I think it's very significant that in the last couple of days, there was this obvious leak from the US to the Financial Times that the US military has been planning and working on options of how to support the Philippine effort to supply the Marines based on the second Thomas Shoal, and that whatever happened, it apparently resulted in the Filipinos being able to reinforce the Sierra Madre, right? I don't know if you saw that report in the FT. So I think there's a game going. Each side is signaling to the other. China is seeing how far it can go. The US is signaling it. Watch it. And I think that's the key thing. Who's that?
I'm Nghi from Vietnam. So
Hi.
we're talking about India and Vietnam and Indonesia. We are racing to, attract the FDI from the foreigners because we gain it from the term alternative supply chain and also the trade war between US and China. So, what do you think, if any, in under any circumstances, that like Mr. Donald Trump will become the president of the United States, and he said that, oh, China is a good friend of the U.S., and why don't we keep manufacturing there, or we should move every company, every factory into the U.S. So in that circumstance, now the India, the Vietnam, Indonesia have to, we have lose the motivation to grow, because we gain things from the alternative supply chain. So if that just somehow gone away, that we have nothing to the force of us to keep growing. And for another questions is, how do you think about Vietnam and India, and for example in Indonesia, is we are racing in a race that we all lose because we have to pay a lot for the FDI, for example, our environment, our human resources, but it's not. They are just unsustainable, and we have
Okay.
somehow we will become another
Yeah.
China. We're very vulnerable to the foreigners when they have the decisions to invest or not invest on us.
Okay. Hope I understood you correctly, but basically, first of all, the process of supply chain reconfiguration predates U.S.-China tension. It really started because China is moving out the value chain. It is no longer competitive in many areas, and that's the first wave of stuff that moved from China to Vietnam. Toys, decorations, footwear. That's the first wave, right? So it's not all about U.S.-China politics. It's also about fundamental economics. One point. Second point is that I think the U.S.-China contestation is here to last. It's not going to go away. There's not going to be a deal between the U.S. and China because it's very fundamental. The U.S. The China wants the U.S. out of the Western Pacific, and the U.S. will not leave the Western Pacific. It's as basic as that. Zero-sum game. So there's not going to be a deal. I mean, whatever people say about Mr. Trump, there's not going to be a deal between the U.S. and China that will change the geopolitical impulse for supply chain reconfiguration. Third point I'd make is, yes, as you open up your economy, you become more dependent on external factors. But that is probably the right thing to do, because you could be like North Korea and just live on your own, but you'll be very, very poor and not very nice. So the key thing is, how do you manage the risks that come along with opening up? And you manage it through diversification. You make sure that you have diverse engines of growth, diverse export markets, diverse sources of foreign investment. You make sure that you build up your domestic capability, that you grow your domestic capability so that your large firms become more competent, more efficient, start developing your own technology and all that. And I think Vietnam is doing that.
Manu Bhaskaran, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.